Hi, welcome to the podcast. I'm Craig Pugsley.
And I'm Tom Hazeldine.
And we're your co-hosts through this, the Product Podcast. So Tom, look, what is the Product Podcast all about?
So the Product Podcast, or Podcast, I love that name by the way, is really going to be about those overlaps, interactions between product management and product design, because they're so close to each other, they're so intertwined, yet in other ways so different. And there's numerous podcasts out there about product management in isolation or product design. I think really exploring those potential synergies, I think that's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads and loads of really good product design podcasts out there that drill into a specific skill or a specific discipline, and you can become, super educated or efficient in a particular area. But, design and product management are team sports, right? Like by their very nature. To be really great, to be really exceptional in your fields, you have to be great at collaborating. You have to foster that ability to work with other disciplines because of the nature and the way it works. So I think, it's for me, that was why I thought this was such a great idea for the two of us to come together and to talk about the creation of great products from these two really fascinating perspectives. So, okay, here's a question then. Why us, right? Why you and me? Why should anyone invest their time in listening to what we're talking about? So I think, look, you and I have been lucky enough to spend many years in the industry in our respective roles, and we've both been in leadership positions as well for several years. So I think it's fair to say that we may not have seen it all, but we've certainly been around the block a few times. Look, Tom, can you give us a quick kind of career summary, please?
Yeah, so I've got about 12 years product management experience, worked for more companies than I probably should have done in that time, moved around a lot. Last 4 roles have been product leadership positions where I've overseen both product management and product design. So I feel like I've got a really interesting insight into how you can get those two, at times very different groups of people to work together, how to get the best out of those people and how you can get genuine alignment between those groups. So I'm super excited to try and explore some of that. So Craig, tell us about you and your background then.
Yeah, so I've been a product designer for, 15, 20 years. It feels like a long time now. I got into product design after pivoting career, I think they call it. I started as an engineer and realised that I actually enjoyed watching people using the things that I was building more than building them. I'm not the world's best engineer. I was doing UX and user research before that was even a thing, before there was the term UX design. And then, fast forward decades, worked through Nokia and Microsoft, grew the craft. I learned about user research and the art that is user research, and then eventually worked at a product research team working at Just Eat, and that was a lot of fun, doing different designs for different platforms, and we were shipping products and process into Just Eat at that time as well, so we were getting to try all these new things like lean startup methodology and all that kind of stuff. Really exciting. And then fast forward a few more years, and most recently, last couple of roles have been design leadership roles, so leading small but tightly packed, really, really efficient product design teams to deliver really good high quality work with just the right level of process behind all of that as well. So, all right, tell us a little bit about the kind of topics that we're hoping to cover in this first series of the podcast.
Well, I think the one I'm most excited about diving into is how do you get product designers and product managers to collaborate effectively, work effectively, and actually deliver more than the sum of the parts. And that is possible. I've seen it happen in lots of different circumstances. So I think that's going to be really interesting to explore. I think how you hire great product designers, product managers, that'll be another really interesting one. And I think how you sell some of the things that are important to those two very sort of close related functions into the rest of the business. Because I think there's some similarities, there's also some differences. So I think some of the things that are going to be most exciting for me to explore. So today it's going to be, how do you get that best collaboration from the product managers and product designers? How do you get to work together most effectively?
Yeah, okay. And that's like, it's super important again, isn't it? And it goes back to this point about both of our industries, or both of our disciplines rather, being a team sport. That collaboration has to be efficient, otherwise neither of us get our job done. So it's like, it's almost like the bedrock, isn't it? The foundation of great product management and great design coming together. Okay, that's cool. So let's get into it. First thing to talk about, right? Where does good product management and good product design collaboration start from your perspective, Tom?
Yeah, I think there's two main things that are front of mind for me there. Firstly is mindset. And what I say always, recently, coach product managers and product designers to do it, is really treat it like any other relationship. Really lean into understanding each other. So how you prefer to work, the kind of things that wind you up, how you prefer to receive feedback. If you can lean into that, there's a really good chance you'll make a sort of fast start in terms of being productive, in terms of working well together. The other key thing from my point of view is alignment on the caliber of the UI and UX you're trying to deliver. And there's an enormous spectrum for that, right, depending on the organisation you're in and where you are in that kind of organisation's life cycle, and actually what you're working on and where that's in its life cycle, because you could be in a very mature business, and in that context, it might be super important you've got a very high caliber UX. But you could be in the same business working on an incubated brand new product where actually scrappier is absolutely fine because you just need to ship things quickly to see if that proposition is going to resonate. Or maybe you're in a scale up and that's just the way you work. So alignment on that is crucial. So I think if you can start with those two things, you've got a really good chance of that relationship starting well.
Yeah, that really resonates actually. I've worked in teams where I've been at the wrong end of the spectrum on both of those bits of alignment. So we've had an organisation, I've worked in organisations where they just need you to deliver quickly. Like, just get something, we're going to take the risk of it not being particularly well tested, but we can ship quickly and we can get iterations out the door that we can then, monitor the analytics on. So, we've kind of got this, we just need to get it out the door. And I've worked with perfectionist designers who will not let that thing, will not hit save on that Figma file until they've got it absolutely perfect. And of course that's not much use to anyone. And then I've worked at the other end of the spectrum where and I maybe have been guilty of this in the past as well, where I've just been moving a bit too quickly and maybe made a few too many assumptions in an organisation that actually has got themselves a bit of time, as you say. They're not fighting for every second of eyeballs in the market, and you actually have a bit more time to be able to do something a bit more structured and a bit more well researched, and actually giving yourself that time to do a few more iterations. A design is never finished. It can almost always benefit from a few more iterations. And like you say, I think the art is knowing where you should stop.
Yeah, and I think to pick up on something you said there that I think is super pertinent, it's risk appetite, right? And the reality versus what people say, because it's almost fashionable these days to say, we should be taking risks, we're taking good risks, smart risks. But when it comes down to it, people's appetite for something to fail completely because you built it and released it quickly without any user testing, oftentimes is a lot lower than people sort of think it is or say it's going to be. So really getting to the bottom of that can save an awful lot of pain down the line, because user testing doesn't have to take that long, right? If you really have to, you could run around a user testing, analyze it in a week. It's absolutely doable if you've got some engaged users. So, is it so urgent you can't spare a week to do some user testing? I think that's the sort of way you need to frame it to yourselves and other stakeholders in the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course that introduces this other sort of slight challenge you've got with the politics of the situation as well. So it might be the product team understand the risks that we're taking here and have a good awareness of what the impact of those might be, and are confident that they could turn around any issues or any challenges or any failed experiments quite quickly. But other parts of the organisation, maybe even people like the engineering or support teams who are sat very close to those product teams, may have a very different appetite to that risk as well. Yeah. And so it's that managing of stakeholders that you're having to do that's wider than the actual product sort of problem that you're trying to solve.
No, that's spot on. And I think that's where, company values are really important, product principles. If you can lock those down, not only have alignment within product, but with engineering, with customer success, support, to your point. So everyone knows you're moving quickly, or everyone knows, delivering a high caliber UX is part of how you work. If you've got that alignment, it's great. If you haven't, it's going to be bumpy, frankly.
So yeah, I should have said at the beginning of this podcast, actually. So I've had the pleasure of working with you. I was employed into your team. You were my line manager at a recent organisation. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here, in terms of collaboration, I think what we had is some of the best examples of that designer product manager relationship. I think. So can we think of any examples of that? Can we pull out any examples of the collaboration that you think between us that was particularly good, the things that kind of resonate with what you were just saying?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the things I thought led to some really successful outcomes was how we do very collaborative ideation, and maybe I'll drill into that in a second. But then I sort of got out of your way and empowered you to conceive the more polished designs, let's say, and then we sort of collaborated again. So I think those sort of distinct phases of the life cycle, if you like. So what I mean, if you go back to that first point, that sort of whiteboarding, that was where, the sort of no boundaries, left field ideas are okay, let's sort of start sketching like crazy on a whiteboard. And, so being initially divergent, but then towards the end of the session, and we're only probably spending 45 minutes to an hour doing that, trying to converge on some kind of directions that we both felt had a good chance of solving the problems. And by the way, that was the thing I really felt I had to be bringing as the product management person, was real clarity on the problems that exist and the problems we should actually be trying to solve. But then that middle phase, really say, okay, great, we've got, here's directions, now, you go away and turn that into some designs, frankly. And what I think that brought is real coherence by just you focusing on it, and hopefully, you felt empowered. And then reconvening when you've had a chance to do that, and starting to go through those, providing any feedback that's appropriate, and so on. So I think almost a deliberate sort of trough in the collaboration, but kind of peaks at either end.
Yeah, totally. I 100% agree with that. And isn't it funny though that session probably only lasted 20 minutes, didn't it? It was like 20-25 minutes. It was. I remember it being quite a short session of actual drawing up the whiteboard after you told us about the scope and the problem, and described the problems that we were trying to solve there. But it's so frequent that those kind of basics get missed. That you don't, the initial discussion between the product manager and the product designer in front of a whiteboard just doesn't happen a lot of times. It certainly doesn't happen with any kind of quality like that. It's super simple stuff that doesn't take very much time, but sets the project up for success from the very beginning, and just gets you going. And then what we were doing there was your classic design council double diamond, right? We were, as you say, we were doing that divergent thinking at the beginning. And then as I took that design away, I remember actually filtering out, because I think we had like 6 or 7 different ideas on that board for how we might solve those problems. And I remember filtering out sort of 3 or 4 of those myself already. So I was already starting to converge back to a selection of ideas that we could then effectively test, which is what we did next. So yeah, I think that's a really great example. Definitely one that resonates with me as well. Okay, so I think this is an interesting one, and it's a point that you mentioned earlier, I think, about getting out of the way of the designers. I've worked with product managers who have got quite different schools of thought on this, and actually good justification both ways as well. So I think it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this one. So I've worked with some product managers who, like you've articulated, say, this is the problem, go away and solve it. Come back when you've got some ideas, come to me if you've got any questions about the requirements or whatever, and they sort of effectively leave you to it. And then you've got other product managers that don't necessarily want to interfere during the process, but certainly want to see a lot of the workings as you're going through, and I want to understand how you've got to that point and what evidence you've got in a much more detailed way, what evidence you've got behind it as well. So what do you think is the most sort of effective way of driving collaboration? Is there one approach that's better than the other?
Yeah, this is a super interesting one. So what I think this comes back to is, I'll answer your question directly in a moment, but where a product managers and product designer is going to have most impact. Because yes, I've no doubt that that there's a lot of value in the ideation phase. I think of having a PM and ideally an engineer and potentially someone from the business involved at that stage. I would wholly buy into that. And there's probably some value in the PM, there being lots of collaboration kind of throughout the design process. But is that really the best use of the product manager's time? I would argue, because that is always your biggest challenge as a product manager. Your most finite resource is your own time. And how you spend that is going to determine whether you're effective or not. It, again, sounds obvious, but remarkable how many product managers spend time on things that don't have impact. So I think my ask when I'm leading blended teams of product people, so product designers and product managers, is that the product managers focus on the strategic things. So deeply understanding the customer, their needs, the problems they're facing, the world in which they operate. Understanding the market, the broader market, where that's headed, the competition, how you're going to position a message, whatever it is, whatever problems you're trying to solve, whatever solutions you come up with. That to me is where the product manager can have most impact, and frankly, where there's a good chance, particularly in a startup, scale up, and even a larger business, where maybe no one else is thinking about those things. The product designer is going to be deeply thinking about that product design. So whilst, yes, you might add 5 or 10% or make that design 5 or 10% better, I think you're going to have a lot bigger impact with your time elsewhere. So that's why I believe actually pretty strongly, yes, get involved in the ideation phase, but then get out of the way of the product designer, then give them feedback on some options. That's utopia for me, is they come back with 2 or 3 options, and you together figure out which is most likely to be the best solution when you look at viability, feasibility, etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an element here of what's the best way of describing it? Almost like clock cycles. How fast do people run at? And I think product managers, just by nature of the job and actually some of the personalities that tend to find themselves in this role, product managers run at a higher clock cycle. There's a lot more inputs, a lot more outputs. They're juggling many, many, many more balls at the same time. You could argue that's sort of the role of the product manager, right? It is to do exactly that. But by the very nature, designers run at a slower clock cycle, because we tend to be focused on, fewer problems at the same time. And actually, when we're in design work, it's usually just the one problem at a specific time and go super deep on that. So it's not necessarily that product designers need more time. It's just that product designers sometimes need more uninterrupted time, because those clock cycles maybe are working a little bit slower. To be able to get deeply into stuff, to push a thought as far as it can go without necessarily being distracted or interrupted, and to its natural conclusion to decide whether that's the right path to go down. So yeah, I agree with that, definitely. Understanding the way that those different disciplines want to get feedback and when, I think, is a really important one to touch on.
And it comes back to a point I made earlier, right, that what's the outcome you need? Do you need a brilliant UX, or do you just need a good solution to the problem? It's more often than not, it's the latter, frankly. So is your input as a product manager, so that product designer's work, is that going to impact whether it's going to be a good solution or not? If you've got a strong product designer, probably not, frankly, or there's going to be a good portion of the time when it won't. They'll come up with more than one good solution themselves. What's going to more materially impact the outcomes is those other things I was talking about, right? So it just comes back down to sheer pragmatism. Now, that might be different. If you're in a B2C environment with tens of millions of users, highly competitive space, then yeah, maybe, and you're shooting for kind of pixel perfect, world-class UX, then yes, maybe you need to be involved throughout the journey. So there's always going to be exceptions to that. But I think more often than not, getting out of the designer's way is going to lead you to optimal outcomes if those outcomes are, driving revenue, solving as many problems with your finite amount of resource as possible, delivering as much customer value as you can.
Yeah. Really interesting. Okay, so the other thing that I think is really important with product design and product management collaboration is it's for the designer to use their skills of empathy and those high EQs that we hire for to really understand the product manager's perspective, and what's pressure in them. We as designers obviously spend so much of our time trying to get into the shoes and the mindset and the context and the worlds of our users, and that's great, and obviously that's what we should be doing. But I think we can turn some of those lenses and some of those skills into our own teams to help make our own relationships more productive. So I think being able to understand what is driving a product manager, I think is really, really important. So I think one of the really important things, one of the first things, is to understand those commercial pressures. Again, it's a little bit of a stereotype, and I don't want to push too much on this because I don't think it's true. Certainly not so much nowadays, and obviously not as you increase, you rise up through the seniority levels. But I think a lot of designers don't really get the commercial pressures. I think there's this idea that we're just doing good work, we're just designing great stuff. We don't really have to worry too much about how we're getting paid or how the business is growing or any of those kind of business or commercial pressures. That's up to someone else to solve. But it's not. Obviously, it's not. It's all of our jobs. We're working for an organisation that has to make money. So it's for all of us to understand those. And I think understanding the product manager's commercial pressures and the drivers that are encouraging them to make certain decisions, I think is really important. How would you say that that's well articulated when it comes to sort of product designers and product managers? How would a good product manager, do you think, articulate that to a product designer?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I agree with your point. I've certainly seen examples where product designers could be a little more commercially minded, but I would say to the point you're building up to, it's incumbent on the product manager to keep hammering away at that until people get it. Because ultimately the role the product managers have impact, right? It typically deliver customer value while simultaneously delivering business value, which normally means revenue growth, but it could be strategic penetration into a particular segment, or it could be reducing churn. There's some classic drivers there that you'll see time and time again in different businesses. But it's a very basic example at times, right, of knowing your audience and finding a way of articulating it that's going to resonate with them. So making it, maybe one kind of provocative way of doing it, I guess, is to point out the implications if we aren't able to move the needle on revenue or whatever metric it is you're trying to. What's that going to mean for our team? Well, maybe it means we get moved on to something different and we don't get to solve these problems anymore, or maybe the business isn't going to be able to get the next funding round, and that's going to have some obvious sort of next unpleasant implications for everyone. So I think knowing your audience, their kind of how much they've been exposed to all things commercial in the past can help. Trying to use concrete, real examples, use user anecdotes as well, I think, or really explain the characteristics of that segment you're trying to get into, if indeed that's the goal, of why that matters, of trying to quote the leader that's asked this particular thing. There's all sorts of ways a product manager can do that, but I think fundamentally it's about EQ, knowing your audience, and delivering things with a bit of passion and gravitas, or as much of that as you can muster.
Yeah. It totally is. And if I think back at some of the best product managers I've worked with, they have been able to articulate the vision and bring their audience along with them. Different types of people as well, different skill sets, different seniority levels, really, really effectively. I totally agree that it is incumbent on the product manager to bring everyone along on that as well. But I think it's also important for the product designer to be open-minded. I think it's very easy, and certainly I would have done this earlier in my career as well, before I realised how important it was, for the designer to sort of switch off as soon as people talk about numbers or about revenue or about stuff that the financial machinery that doesn't really make a lot of sense to a lot of people. And fine, that's right. That's not what they're employed to understand, and that's fully understandable. But there are still elements of the commercial nature of what you're doing that are incumbent on every product designer to understand.
Yeah, and I also think that the product manager's got to be savvy about how they keep repeating those messages. First, people rarely absorb things or truly absorb or digest them the first time they hear them. But there's lots of ways you can do that, right? You don't just have to do it verbally. What I've often done is weave that into broader Slack messages. So maybe you're celebrating some success about something the squad or the tribe has achieved, but then let's not forget we've still got a way to go to hit this commercial goal. We've still got to solve these problems so that we deliver against that business objective. So there's more subtle ways you can do it in stand-ups as well, just reminding people, come on, we've got 3 more weeks, we've got to get this solution built by then, or conceived by whatever it might be. So they're not particularly onerous things for product managers to do, but you need to sort of stay on it and not just expect people to fully get that narrative after just articulating it once.
Yeah, yep, totally. And I actually remember a couple of examples from our past that just resonated with me here as well. So I think one of the things that you did really well was that you would create a Notion page at the beginning of a project that clearly documented all of this, including the success criteria. So these are the success metrics. These are the specific metrics that we want to move. And then I would take that particular one-liner, whatever that metric might be, and put that in the Figma file. So that would almost be like the heading. It would be the thing, that I was working towards. It's a bit of a North Star for this piece of work. And that was great because what we do, certainly in the convergent stages of design, is to have some kind of criteria for filtering out all of the other options and other concepts. So being able to have, your design principles in there, feedback from other stakeholders, and then that success metric, the thing that we're trying to move with this piece of work, front and center, actually in the Figma file, in its own little frame, that's consistent on every piece of work that we do, keeps us true to that. And actually, then from a designer's perspective, when you're trying to justify your solution, you can keep referring back to that, and it's very difficult to argue against it.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I think it. One conversation I remember us having it in a few different contexts was that I use a term. I don't know if I particularly like this term, but I'm going to mention it. This idea of gold plating, and I think it helps with having that what can be quite a difficult conversation. So in other words, de-scoping a design, but you can link it back to that headline. It's okay. Well, is that really going to drive that metric? Well, maybe not a whole lot. Well, if we did this other thing with that same amount of time or same amount of engineering resource, would that move the needle more against it? Well, yeah, probably. Okay, well, that's why we're de-scoping this design then, right? So I think that's one conduit, to your point, for driving a commercial mindset within people who perhaps it doesn't necessarily come naturally to.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of designers' mindset is going to be to ship something as close to perfect as possible, right? Or to design something as close as possible as perfect. So I think, this all comes back to this point about alignment, and making sure that the designer is fully aware, and the product manager as well, I suppose, can fully articulate what that good enough looks like.
Yeah.
To be able to move to the next stage, really, for a piece of work.
Yeah, and just one final point on that. I think it's good enough. It's fascinating, right? Because so much of what we worked on actually was the first time we built anything to solve that problem, right? And one thing I remember saying, I felt I'm saying this too many times at the time, was sort of what was going through my head, was that this is a hell of a lot better than nothing that we've got at the moment. This is going to solve the problem. It may not solve it perfectly, but it's a solution. They have zero right now, and that on the one level is blindingly obvious, but it's easy to lose sight of that in the moment when you're, feeling maybe a little concerned, worried, whatever, about chopping off some aspects of that design.
Okay, another question for you then. This is a really interesting one, I think, to touch on for a while. So obviously we're both leaders in our own domains, our own spaces. And I think obviously we're leading in focusing on different areas as well. So I do line management and creative direction, and I think that's quite an interesting tension sometimes between the sort of creative discipline and a more analytical kind of practical discipline. But when we're doing projects, when product designers and product managers are doing projects together, who leads that project? And I've worked in organisations, and I certainly feel like the design team there should be a natural level of sort of subservience, really, to the way that designers approach the relationship to the rest of the business. And I don't mean that in a distanced way, in a kind of agency inside the organisation. I don't think that being at arm's length is necessarily particularly effective, but certainly in terms of who leans into those discussions to carry them forward and makes a project keeps a project's momentum up at different stages of that. I think there's a really interesting question there about whether the product manager or the product designer should be leading. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is another super interesting one, and we've talked about this quite a lot, in other conversations. And I'm a little twitchy about the subservience point. I know what you're getting at. I think there's parts of it I agree with, but I think I'd be a little wary of framing it that way. But I think one thing where we'd certainly align is that ultimately the call on whether that solution solves the problem, that has to lie with the product manager. And more often than not, what I've found is there's actually an agreement on that. So it's not that common where there's an outright heated debate that has to happen there. To sort of come to your other points there about who's kind of leading and driving and things, I think it's incumbent the product manager is accountable for that, moving at a good pace, and ultimately, to come back to a point I've made before, using that engineering development time, whatever you call it, as wisely as they possibly can to get the maximum customer value, business value, whatever goals you're sort of driving towards, so that they're accountable for that. Whereas, I would argue if you're using a racing matrix style approach, a designer is responsible and they should play their part, but it's on the product manager. So, I think it would be fair to say the product manager is going to be leading more, but I would be very wary of kind of removing all expectations on the product designer to be leading. And I think the reason I say that is I think that the person in the leadership seat, if you look at a classic life cycle of a feature or a solution, does need to evolve. So at the beginning, when it's understanding the customer, the problem, the market, I would argue the product manager should be leading that, but the product designer has to be involved. They need to be in all those pure product discovery calls. But then when it comes to solutioning, like we've talked about, product manager in a perfect world will be involved in that ideation, the broad divergent thinking at the beginning. But then, then I would argue the product designer should be in the leadership role. Right? They should be conceiving the different options, focusing down. But then when it comes to kind of refining them at the end, giving feedback, signing off a solution, I think it's, the product manager should be back in the sort of leadership role there. So overall, I'd argue it's the product manager, but that does need to flex and evolve throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I totally agree. And I want to come back to this subservient point because I mentioned it purely because I know it pushes your button. Okay, let's get practical for a minute then, and talk about like specific ways of fostering great collaboration. And specifically, I'm thinking about sometimes designers can be slightly highly strung or maybe a little bit sensitive. I'm not going to say all of them, and certainly the more senior you get in your role, the more the sort of assumption is that you can keep a handle on some of the emotional side. But by our very nature, we are more empathetic, more emotional kind of people, and that's just fine. So what would be your sort of top tips for ways to make sure that you're not winding up a designer?
Yeah, I think it's super important to be aware of that as the product manager. So a few things come to mind there. I think, firstly, complete clarity on the problems you're trying to solve, and you're assuming in the first instance you understand the problems that exist, and which you've got a right to try and solve, are feasible to solve, etc., etc. But you need that clarity as a first thing. Secondly, leaving Figma, Adobe XD, or whatever design tool you're using to the designer. I think it's unusual. I've seen one or two instances where a product manager that has been a product designer can be helpful in that setting, but treading on toes doesn't begin to describe, I think, the feeling you can leave a product designer with if you start meddling around with their design files. So I'd encourage product managers to stay out of Figma, frankly. Another one that I certainly fell into this trap earlier in my career was being very prescriptive about what should change in a solution or a design that a product designer has come up with. So if you just move this here, move that there, use a different font, or change this colour from blue to orange, all of that stuff is likely to grate. And the reason it's likely to grate is that there's going to be all sorts of lenses, perspectives that the product designer has sort of considered to get to that design right. What's elsewhere in the app? Maybe their design principles, the design system, design best practices. A ton of stuff's going to go into that your average product manager probably isn't going to fully appreciate. So that kind of feedback, I would argue, is at best unhelpful and probably quite likely to sort of aggravate or irritate. But what is a much better way of giving feedback, in my view, is to link it back to the problems you're trying to solve, the use cases you're trying to serve, some of the requirements, or sort of constraints you might have put on the solution. And I think you'll find if you do that as a product manager, that most product designers receive that well. This part of design works really well, but this part, remember that third requirement I gave you, or that second use case, we're not quite hitting that right because of X. And I think that's a sort of important side point there, is always explaining why you don't feel like something's quite working. It sounds blindingly obvious, but I've seen so many Figma files with just sort of blunt bits that this doesn't work. Well, why not? You've got to communicate that. And I guess the other point I'd make is diving in and starting to provide feedback before someone's even finished their designs, because I don't profess to be a world expert in product design, but I certainly know it well enough that it's an iterative process, right? And there's one diagram I think that some people use to describe product design, where it's that sort of wiggly line that gets sort of less wiggly over time. And if you're interfering here, you're interrupting the design process. And even if you've only given someone half a day or a day to conceive some options, interfering at that point is going to be deeply unhelpful and frustrating to the product designer. So wait till they're done.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That wiggly line that gets straight, it's exactly how almost every designer I've ever worked with, including myself, works. Because what you want to get to is a point where you can fully articulate the rationale for your proposed solution, or even set of concepts, because that is what we're hired for. We're hired to come up with that rationale. We're hired to produce something that has been considered and considered within the constraints that you've set out. So we want to get to a point where we can say, this is the end result, this is what we're proposing it's going to look like, or how it's going to work, or what copy we're going to use, or whatever, and this is why. And that's what we can't do. We can't fully articulate that why if people jump in halfway through.
Yeah.
And what we don't like, and certainly I don't like personally, is being left kind of having to think up reasons on the fly, because that never works. It's clear then that there's holes in your justification for what you want to do, and it might be a really sound design that you've got, and it might be that it's not a little behind the scenes here for some that I think some designers do. Certainly, I've done in the past. It might be that you can get from A to D, you can get to that final design quite quickly, but not necessarily have the best articulation of how you got there. until you start to think of it sometimes. And for me, it's just because I've got a subconscious process that's going a lot faster than my mouth is. So I can't tell you why I've got there unless I'm given enough time, or a little bit more time, just to think fully through the rationale. You could say I'm just inventing a rationale for a solution that I want to put forward, and that's not the case. I never do that.
No. But I think the crucial point there, we're talking about giving designers a bit more time. It's all relative, right? We're not talking about days or weeks. It can be hours, right? I think this is the misconception I've seen with some leadership people at times, just not appreciating. It's a matter of a couple more hours, or a good designer can do a lot in a day if they really need to. So, yeah, I think sometimes there needs to be a little bit of a reframing or recalibrating on that.